Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Loss, Love, and all the other shit in between. And welcome to season 3. Wow, it still feels strange saying that out loud because you don't really notice transitions in life while they are happening. There is no clean moment where one chapter ends and another begins. No clear line where everything resets and you step into something new. Life doesn't give you that structure. It doesn't pause and announce change. It just keeps moving. And somewhere in that movement, things shift without you fully realizing it at the time. You only see it afterwards. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently, just how quickly time moves without ever asking for permission. You think you're in control of it while you're inside it. But when you look back properly, you realize how much it has actually changed while your attention was elsewhere. The people, the priorities, the decisions, even the way you think about yourself. All of it evolves quietly in the background. And I'll be honest with you, I went back and forth quite a bit on what I wanted this first episode of season 3 to be about. There were loads of directions I could have taken it in. Personal reflection, growth, relationships, change, lessons from the past year, all of that. But I kept coming back to one theme that sits underneath almost everything, whether we acknowledge it or not: money. Now, I know the second people hear that word, it tends to create a reaction because money is one of those subjects that people rarely sit neutrally with. It becomes something you either chase, avoid, fear, or dismiss completely. It divides opinion instantly. Some people see it as freedom, others see it as pressure. Some see it as a success, others see it as corruption. But none of those extreme positions really get to the truth of it, because this podcast has never really been about money in that way. It has always been about life, loss, love, and all the other shit in between. And money just happens to sit right in the middle of all of that, whether we like it or not, because it influences everything. The way we make decisions, the way we handle pressure, the way we plan, the way we react, the way we see ourselves when things are going well and when things are not. It sits quietly in the background of so many choices we make that we rarely stop long enough to question its role. So when I really sat with this idea, I realized this episode is not actually about money at all. It's about the route we take through life while trying to figure everything out along the way. That is why I called it Money, the Route to Live. And that capital E at the end of live was intentional. If you read it backwards, it spells evil. And I think that idea has always been attached to money in some sort of way. The belief that money is the root of everything wrong, that it corrupts people, that it changes people, that it exposes something negative by default. But I do not agree with that. I do not think money is good or evil. I do not think it carries intention. I think it is neutral. It is a tool, and like any tool, it depends entirely on who is using it. And that's where things become interesting, because money does not really change people, it reveals people. And once you understand that properly, your relationship with it starts to shift. You stop giving it power it was never meant to have. You stop fearing it, you stop chasing it blindly, and you start seeing it for what it actually is: a resource, a responsibility, and for most people, something deeply tied to how they move through life itself. And that brings me into something I've been thinking about a lot lately: mindset, awareness, the ability to understand why you think the way you think in the first place. You know, I was thinking about this episode during the week, and it's funny, really, because often people say hindsight's a wonderful thing, don't they? We all look back and think, if only I'd known then what I know now. And some people spend their whole lives trying to predict the future, wanting foresight, wanting to know what's around the corner. But I think the older I've got, and perhaps the more life has kicked me up the arse over the years, I've realized something. I don't think hindsight is everything. I don't think foresight is everything. But I do think mindsight is everything, because understanding yourself changes everything. Understanding why you do what you do, why you spend the way you spend, why some people fear money and others chase it, why some people can never seem to have enough no matter how much they earn. And honestly, if you're anything like me, nobody really sat me down growing up and taught me about money. Because before you even talk about money properly, you have to understand it yourself. Now, financial freedom is one of those phrases that gets used so often that it almost starts to lose meaning. But if you strip away the noise around it, what it actually represents is surprisingly simple. It's not about luxury in the way people usually assume. It's not about showing off or reaching a certain number or reaching a point where money stops mattering entirely. It's about pressure, or more specifically, the reduction of pressure in your everyday decision making. Because when financial pressure exists in the background of your life, even in small ways, it changes how you think without you always realizing it. It influences the decisions you make, the risks you take, the conversations you avoid, and the opportunities to say no to before you even properly considered them. It becomes a constant layer running underneath everything else. And the difficult part is that most people adapt to that pressure over time. It becomes normal. You get used to checking your bank account before making decisions. You get used to thinking in short time frames. You get used to prioritizing what is urgent over what is meaningful. And slowly, without noticing, that becomes your baseline for how life works. But just because something becomes normal does not mean it is aligned with what you actually want. Financial freedom in its real form is not a destination where everything suddenly becomes effortless. It is a gradual shift in how you much control pressure has over your decisions. It is the difference between reacting to life and being able to respond to it. It is the difference between feeling like every decision has immediate consequences and being able to think further ahead than the next problem in front of you. And when you start looking at it like that, you realize that financial freedom is not really about money in isolation. It's about space, mental space, emotional space, time space, the ability to step back from constant urgency and actually think clearly about direction rather than survival. Because survival thinking is very short term by nature. It focuses on what needs to be solved now, what needs to be fixed immediately, what needs attention today in order to get things through, to get you through to tomorrow. And while that mindset is sometimes necessary, living inside it permanently creates a very narrow view of life. Everything becomes about managing pressure rather than building something meaningful over time. And that is where people often feel stuck, even when they are working hard. It's not a lack of effort, it's the constant presence of pressure that keeps pulling attention back to immediate concerns instead of long-term direction. Financial freedom starts to change that relationship. Even small improvements in stability begin to shift how you think. You start to notice that you're not making every decision under urgency. You start to realize that you can think a bit further ahead. You can delay certain decisions. You can plan rather than react. And that shift, even if it is gradual, changes the way you experience your own life. Because once pressure reduces, thinking expands. And when thinking expands, you stop seeing your life only in terms of what is happening right now and start seeing it in terms of what you're building over time. That's where planning becomes more natural. That's where consistency becomes more important. That is where you begin to understand that progress is not always visible day to day, but it becomes obvious when you zoom out far enough. And this is where financial freedom connects directly to something deeper, which is time. Because when people talk about wanting more money, what they're often really talking about is wanting more control over their time, more flexibility in how they spend their day, more ability to choose what they focus on instead of having every hour already accounted for. Time to think, time to rest, time to live without everything feeling like a constant obligation. Time is the thing people are actually trying to create space for, even if they do not always see it directly. And once you see that clearly, financial freedom stops being about accumulation and starts being about intention. It becomes less about chasing a number and more about reducing friction in your life so you can make decisions from a clearer place. Because when you're constantly under pressure, even good opportunities can feel heavy. Even positive changes can feel stressful. Even progress can feel exhausting. But when your pressure reduces, everything becomes lighter to engage with. Not easier necessarily, but clearer. And clarity is what most people are really searching for underneath everything else. Clarity about direction, clarity about priorities, clarity about what actually matters and what does not. Because with clarity, even progress can feel confusion. And with clarity, even small steps start to feel meaningful. Financial freedom is really the process of moving towards that clarity by reducing the noise that makes decision making harder than it needs to be. And that naturally leads into the next part of this conversation. Because once you start thinking about more clearly about money, pressure, and time, the next question becomes what you actually do with it, how you grow it, how you build it, how you use it in a way that supports long-term thinking instead of short-time reaction. That's where investing begins. Investing is one of those subjects that tends to get overcomplicated very quickly. And I think a lot of that comes from the way it is spoken about rather than what it actually has at its core. People attach jargon to it. They attach fear to it. They attach assumptions about intelligence, access, or experience that makes it feel like something you either understand or you don't. But when you strip it all away, investing is actually very simple in principle. It is the act of putting something in now with the expectation that it will grow over time. And that is it. The complexity only really appears when people start trying to control the outcome or expect immediate results from something that is fundamentally built around patience. Because investing is not designed for instant feedback. It does not reward urgency. It does not respond to emotional decisions making in the short term. It exists in a completely different rhythm, one that is closer to time and consistency than it is to reaction. And that's where most people struggle with it, not because they do not understand that idea, but because they're not used to waiting without visible confirmation. That's what they are doing is working. We live in a world where most things get immediate responses. You press a button and something happens instantly. You send a message and you get a reply. You make a decision and you see a result almost straight away. So when people approach investing with that same expectation, it can feel like nothing is happening for long periods of time. And in that silence, doubt starts to form. People begin to question whether it is working. They begin to wonder if they're doing it correctly. They start comparing short-term movement instead of understanding long-term direction. And sometimes that leads them to step away too early, not because the process is wrong, but because their expectation of speed does not match the reality how growth actually works over time. Because real growth is rarely visible in the short term, it builds gradually, layer by layer, decision by decision, contribution by contribution. And then at some point, when enough time has passed, the pattern becomes visible. But that visibility is usually the result of consistency rather than sudden change. And this is where discipline becomes important, because investing is not just a financial action, it's a behavioral one. It requires you to continue doing something even when there is no immediate reward or emotional reinforcement. It requires you to trust a process that does not constantly give you feedback. And that is uncomfortable for most people because we're not used to operating without confirmation. But that discomfort is where growth begins to separate itself from reaction. Because reaction is emotional. It responds to what is happening right now. It adjusts constantly based on short-term movement. But long-term thinking requires something different. It requires consistency, even when nothing feels like it is changing. It requires patience, even when progress feels invisible. And it requires trust in that direction that is not immediately obvious every single day. And that's where investing starts to reflect something much deeper than money itself. It becomes a mirror of how people think about time, consistency, and patience in general. Because the same pattern that causes people to struggle with investing often shows up in other areas of life too. People start things with enthusiasm, but stop when results are not immediate. They shift direction quickly when something feels slow. They look for certainty in decisions and situations that only reveals themselves over time, and they underestimate how much consistency matters compared to intensity. But investing quietly teaches the opposite of that. It shows you that small, consistent actions repeated over long periods of time often produce far more meaningful results than short bursts of intense effort that are not sustained. And that idea applies for far beyond money. It applies to habits. It applies to learning. It applies to health. It applies to anything that develops over time rather than instantly. Another important part of investing is starting small, because a lot of people delay beginning anything until they feel ready, or until they feel like they understand enough, or until they have enough to make it worthwhile. But readiness is often something that comes through doing, not something that exists before it. Starting small removes pressure. It allows you to learn without fear of major consequence. It allows you to build consistency without needing perfection. And it allows you to understand the process through experience rather than assumption. And over time, those small actions begin to compound, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually in a way that becomes more obvious the further you look back. And that idea of compounding is one of the most important principles in investing, because it shows how time itself becomes a factor in growth, not just action, but duration. The length of time you stay consistent becomes just as important as what you are doing in the first place. And when you understand that properly, investing stops being something intimidating or complicated and starts becoming something logical, not easy, but understandable. A system based on patience, repetition, and long-term thinking rather than reaction or emotion. And once you reach that understanding, the conversation naturally shifts again, because it raises another question about how you structure your actual life in a way that supports that kind of thinking, how you build discipline into your day, how you create consistency in your habits, and how you manage your time and attention in a way that aligns with long-term goals rather than short-time distractions. That's where discipline and routine comes in. The idea of waking up early, or more specifically, something like a 5 a.m. routine, is one of those things that gets talked about in extremes. People either see it as the foundation of discipline and success, or they dismiss it completely, or unnecessary, or unrealistic. But like most things in life, the truth sits somewhere in the middle, and it has far less to do with the actual time on the clock than it does with what time represents. Because this is not really about 5 a.m. It's about what happens when the world is still quiet enough for you to hear yourself think. Most people spend the majority of their day reacting. From the moment they wake up, there is input coming in from every direction. Messages, notifications, responsibilities, work demands, conversations, expectations. Everything competes for attention, and in that constant flow of external input, it becomes very easy to lose connection with your own direction. You start responding to life instead of shaping it. And that's where early hours, for many people, become powerful. Not because they are magical in themselves, but because they remove noises temporarily. They create a window where there is less interruption, less urgency, less external demand on your attention. And in that space, thinking becomes clearer. Not because you suddenly become more intelligent in the morning, but because there is simply less competing for your focus. And focus is everything. Because without focus, even the best intentions gets diluted across too many directions. You start things but do not finish them. You move between ideas but do not build momentum. You stay busy but not necessarily effective. And over time, they can create a feeling of emotion without progress. Discipline is what interrupts that pattern. But discipline is often misunderstood. People tend to associate with restriction or pressure or forcing yourself to do things you don't want to do. But real discipline is not about punishment. It's about alignment. It's the ability to act in accordance from what you say matters to you, even when your immediate feelings do not fully support in that moment. Because motivation is inconsistent. It rises and falls based on energy, emotion, environment, and circumstance. It's not something you can rely on long term. It can help you start, but it's not what keeps you going. Because discipline is what keeps you consistent when motivation is not present. And when you start combining discipline with awareness, something important begins to shift. You stop relying on how you feel in the moment to determine what you do next. Instead, you begin to operate from intention, from structure, from a sense of direction that is not constantly changed based on short-term emotions. And that's where routines begin to matter. Not because the routine itself is special, but because repetition creates identity. The things you repeatedly do start to take shape before you see it yourself. And if you consistently act in focused and intentional way, over time you begin to identify as someone who is focused and intentional. And once identity starts to align with behavior, consistency becomes easier because it's no longer something you are forcing. It is something that you feel aligned with and basically who you are becoming. And that's where long-term change actually happens. Not in a dramatic shift, not in sudden breakthroughs, but in small repeated actions that slowly reshape your sense of self. And when you apply that thinking to something like early mornings, it's not about waking up at a specific hour to prove something. It's about creating space where you can direct your attention intentionally before the rest of the world begins to influence it. That time can be used for thinking, planning, learning, or simply grounding yourself before the demands of the day begin. Because once the day starts, attention gets pulled in multiple directions. But when you take even a small portion of time before that begins, you regain a sense of control over how you enter your day rather than immediately being absorbed by it. And control in this context is not about rigidity. It's about choice, the ability to choose how you begin rather than being pulled immediately into reaction. And when you zoom out, discipline, focus, and routine are not separate ideas. They are all connected to the same principle, the ability to direct your energy intentionally over time instead of letting it be fragmented by external demands. Because most people do not fail because they lack ability. They struggle because their attention is scattered, and scattered attention leads to scattered progress. But when attention becomes more focused, even in small windows of time, the impact compounds, just like investing, just like habits, just like anything else that builds over time rather than instantly. And this brings everything in this episode full circle, because whether we're talking about awareness, financial freedom, investing, or discipline, all of it is ultimately about the same thing: how you choose to move through your life with intention instead of reaction. And that leads into what all of this is really building towards: legacy. And at this point in the conversation, everything starts to come back to something simpler than money, simpler than discipline, simpler even than success or failure. It comes back to what kind of life you're actually building while you're busy trying to figure everything out. Because life does not wait for clarity. It does not pause until you feel ready. It does not slow down until you feel confident. It just keeps moving forward, moment by moment, decision by decision, day by day. And somewhere inside that movement, you are shaping something whether you realize it or not. And that is what legacy actually is. It's not a final chapter that only gets written at the end. It's not something reserved for people who reach a certain level of achievement or recognition. Legacy is happening now. It is being shaped on how you show up when things are easy and how you show up when things are not. It's in the choices you make when nobody is watching. It's in the way you treat yourself when no one else is around to hear it. Because the way you speak to yourself matters more than most people realize. The way you respond to setbacks matters. The way you handle uncertainty matters. And the way you keep going when things feel unclear matters more than any single moment of success ever will. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this episode, it is this: you are not behind. You are not too late. You're not disqualified from life you want just because you have not figured everything out yet. There is this pressure that builds in people over time. The idea that at a certain point in life, you're supposed to have everything mapped out, clear direction, clear progress, clear answers. But that's not how most lives actually unfold. Most people are still figuring things out while they're already in motion. They're still learning while they're already building. They're still becoming while they're already living. And that's not a weakness. That is just reality. The important part is not having everything figured out. The important part is not abandoning yourself in the process of trying to figure it out. because it is very easy to start measuring your life against external timelines, other people's progress, other people's highlights, other people's version of success. And when you do that, you lose sight of your own direction. You start chasing something that was never aligned with you in the first place. But when you come back to yourself, when you strip all of that away, something becomes clearer. Your time matters, your attention matters, your energy matters, and the way you choose to use those things in shaping your life far more than probably you realize in the moment. So yes, build the financial freedom, understand money, learn how it works, take control of your decisions, create stability, grow something meaningful, but never at the cost of losing yourself in the process. Because the goal was never just accumulation. The goal was always life, a life that feels like yours, a life that feels honest, a life where you're not constantly performing or chasing or comparing, but actually present in what you're building and who you are becoming. And if things feel uncertain right now, if the path feels unclear, if you are somewhere in between where you were and where you want to be, that's not a sign that something is wrong. That is often just a space where change is happening quietly underneath everything else. And you don't need to rush through it. You just need to stay in it. Stay honest with yourself. Stay aware of where you are going and keep taking steps, even small ones, in a direction that feels aligned with who you actually are. Because that is how everything meaningful gets built. Not all at once, but over time, through consistency, through awareness, through intention, and through the decision to keep going even when things are not perfectly clear yet. So keep going, not because everything is already certain, but because your life is still unfolding, and you are the one that is living it. And before I go, I just want to say a huge big thank you to you all, not just for listening or watching, but for being here in this moment, giving your time, your attention, your energy. That is something I will never take lightly, because time is the one thing we can't replace. You can rebuild money, you can restart plans, you can change direction with your own journey, you can recover from mistakes and start new relationships, but you don't ever get time back once it's gone. So the fact you chose to spend some of yours with me today means more than you probably will ever realize. And if even one part of this episode reminded you of who you are, or what you want, or what you've been putting off, or what you've been forgetting about yourself, then that is enough for me. That is the whole point of this. Not to tell you who to be, but to remind you to stay close to who you already are. Because sometimes you miss the bus because you are meant to walk and see something beautiful along the way. Not every delay is bad. Sometimes life slows you down to help you, not hurt you. Maybe you're being protected. Maybe you're being redirected. So don't stress when things don't go your way. Take a breath. Keep moving. The detour might be the best part of your story. This is loss, love, and all the other shit in between. And I'll see you in the next one. Love. Thank you.